"Get out, boy!" Judge didn't know the kid was the youngest lawyer ever. The courthouse air was stale, thick with tension and murmurs as the victim stepped through the heavy oak doors, the sound of his shoes swallowed by the creaking floorboards and the collective inhale of curious onlookers. 16-year-old Elijah Harmon looked out of place in every visible sense. The sleeves of his gray suit jacket brushed awkwardly past his knuckles, his thin shoulders seemed lost beneath the fabric, and his worn leather briefcase bumped against his leg as he walked. An heirloom more than a tool, something borrowed from another time. His face, though youthful, carried a gravity that felt older than the room itself, as though he had walked not just through the courthouse doors, but through fire, loss, and a deep reservoir of unspoken knowledge. His steps were slow but deliberate, each one guided not by fear but by purpose, by a need that had festered long enough to become hunger. A hush rolled over the gallery like a wave as Elijah made his way down the center aisle. There was no fanfare, no dramatic music or flashing cameras, just the low buzz of disbelief and confusion. A woman in the front row squinted, nudging the man beside her. A few reporters sat up straighter in their seats, fingers twitching over their tablets. One of them smirked as if the boy's presence was some kind of pre-trial comedy sketch. A security guard, resting casually against a marble column near the entrance, leaned toward a nearby bailiff with a bemused grin and whispered his question with a chuckle. Was the kid lost? But Elijah didn't look left or right. His eyes remained steady, forward, unwavering. He wasn't here to entertain. He wasn't here for permission. His gaze locked with the man sitting at the far end of the room, behind a polished table and layers of legal armor, Charles R. DeWitt. The retired senator looked composed, dressed in a navy blue suit so sharp it almost sparkled beneath the courtroom lights. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his posture flawless, and his expression unreadable. He glanced up at the boy, his brows knitting slightly, as if trying to place him. A flicker of recognition surfaced, and then just as quickly was masked by indifference. DeWitt had faced dozens of trials throughout his long career, hearings, depositions, closed-door sessions where power shifted and sins were negotiated behind handshakes. But today was different. Today, he wasn't walking in with the protection of party lines or the cushion of political favor. Today, he was the defendant in a federal courtroom, accused of using his influence to systematically erase low-income housing across the state, primarily targeting communities of color. The evictions had destabilized families, torn apart neighborhoods, and in at least one case, ended a life. That life had belonged to Clarence Ray, Elijah's foster father, an elderly black man who had survived 2 wars and a lifetime of struggle, only to die shivering in the parking lot of a shelter that wouldn't take him because his last address had been bulldozed 2 days before. And it was DeWitt's signature on the clearance order. Elijah's heart thudded against his ribs as he neared the prosecution's table. His fingers tightened around the handle of the briefcase. He wasn't nervous. Not anymore. The nerves had burned away weeks ago, replaced by something colder and more precise. He could feel the weight of the USB drive still in his inner jacket pocket, could feel the pages of Clarence's final letters folded neatly behind his notepad. He remembered every night he sat awake, reading through documents, cross-referencing property records, listening to his foster father's coughing fits in the next room. He remembered the day Clarence had collapsed, slumped in a metal chair beneath a flickering street lamp, his body curled inwards like a question never answered. Now, as he set the briefcase on the prosecution's table and began to unfasten the latches, the lead prosecutor turned, startled. Alan Greer, a man in his late 40s with a tired face and a tie loosened just slightly beneath his collar, stared at him with narrowed eyes. His voice dropped low, half annoyed and half bewildered. He asked what the hell the kid was doing there, told him this wasn't a visitor gallery and he needed to move back before someone got him thrown out. But Elijah didn't flinch. He opened the briefcase slowly, methodically, like he had done it 100 times before. He told Greer that he was co-counsel on the case. The words were simple, quiet, but they fell like a rock into a still lake. Greer blinked, thrown off for a second, and then looked toward the clerk at the edge of the bench as if to confirm whether this was a joke. A slow rustle moved through the room. Chairs creaked, pens paused mid-stroke. Even the court stenographer glanced up. The judge, Donald Trammer, leaned forward in his chair with a grimace. He was a man built on reputation, sharp-edged, politically fortified, and openly impatient with what he deemed dramatics. His deep-set eyes peered over his glasses, which he adjusted with 2 fingers in a practiced gesture that always preceded a reprimand. His voice echoed through the chamber with clipped irritation as he addressed the boy directly. He didn't ask questions. He gave orders. "Young man, get out." Now the gavel slammed once, ringing sharp across the walls. "This is a federal courtroom, not a school play." The words snapped through the tension like lightning. Laughter rippled from one corner of the gallery. A few people shook their heads. The bailiff took a step forward, already preparing to escort the boy out. Trammer's lips curled into a half-smirk as he added one final command. "Get out, boy." But Elijah stood still. The moment froze, hanging in the air like the pause before a storm. Something shifted, not in the room but in the weight of the silence. Elijah didn't raise his voice or plead his case. He simply met the judge's gaze, unblinking, as if daring him to look past the suit, past the age, past the carefully curated disbelief of the courtroom. His stance didn't waver. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, placing it on the table with deliberate care. There was no grand speech, no dramatic unveiling, just quiet resolve, burning under the surface like a fuse. No one in the room could have understood what was really happening. Not yet. Not the court reporter documenting the outburst, not the reporters drafting their headlines, not even Greer, whose face had now twisted into confusion laced with caution. Only a few people in the world knew what Elijah was carrying, not just in that folder, but in his memory, his bloodstream, his grief. Only a handful understood why a 16-year-old boy had the legal authority to stand at that table, and fewer still knew how close the room was to igniting. Because 2 weeks earlier, something had happened that rewired the gears behind this moment. Something buried in closed-door meetings, encrypted emails, and hollowed-out walls of silence. Something that transformed a grieving foster child into a legal force. A decision, a betrayal, a buried voice that would scream through the cracks of power. Only a handful of people knew, but soon the whole world would. 2 weeks ago, Elijah hadn't stepped into a courtroom as a legal figure. He had stepped into a dark corner of Washington, D.C. politics. He had been accepted into an elite law mentorship program months prior, a program designed for the brightest young minds, handpicked from a pool of aspiring future leaders. Elijah, though, hadn't just been accepted because of his academic accolades. He had been fast-tracked because of his astonishing aptitude in constitutional law. At 14, he passed the bar in 3 states. At 16, he was already advising state representatives on legislation and drafting briefs. He wasn't just a legal prodigy. He was the kind of student who'd been groomed for high-stakes legal battles. But it wasn't until the death of Clarence Ray, his foster father, that Elijah fully understood how deeply the system was rigged, how it turned people into pawns to protect the untouchable. Clarence had been an institution of wisdom and quiet strength in Elijah's life, a man who had witnessed the world change in ways only veterans could fully comprehend. A war hero and a pillar of the black community, Clarence was someone who fought not just on foreign soil, but within the very borders of his own country. He fought for the rights of his brothers and sisters, especially when it came to the veterans' housing they had been promised, a right that, over time, had become little more than a bureaucratic lie. For months, Clarence had filed multiple complaints about illegal evictions carried out in Eastbridge Housing, a community meant for war veterans. He was systematically ignored, his complaints buried beneath the red tape that served the rich and the powerful. Every case he pursued was dismissed. Every appeal he filed was denied. But what stung the most was the silence that followed his complaints, the kind of silence that suffocated the truth. The kind of silence that meant people like Clarence, and by extension Elijah, didn't matter. It wasn't until just a week before Clarence's death that Elijah understood the depths of corruption that had stained their fight for justice. Clarence had told him, in a hoarse whisper from his sickbed, that DeWitt was the puppet master pulling the strings. DeWitt. He owns these people, he had said, his breath ragged. Elijah had never fully understood what that meant until after Clarence collapsed, an image forever etched in Elijah's mind. He had died before getting the chance to testify, dying in the cold, indifferent embrace of the system he had spent his last years trying to expose. His final days had been spent surrounded by paperwork, letters, and legal notices, none of which could undo the damage caused by the wealthy senator's influence. None of which could prevent his death from being swept away like so many others, buried beneath a mountain of lies. In the wake of Clarence's death, Elijah had found the key to unraveling the conspiracy buried deep in the shadows. He had gone into the house that had once been filled with the warmth of Clarence's wisdom and combed through every drawer, every book, every corner where the old man's secrets might have been hidden. It was there, in a hollowed-out Bible on the second shelf of their bookshelf, that Elijah found it. The USB drive. Its tiny form felt like the weight of the world when he held it in his hand. It was a Pandora's box, one that had been carefully hidden from prying eyes. When Elijah plugged it into his laptop, he was met with a flood of damning evidence, emails between Senator DeWitt and 3 federal judges. There were names. There were bank transfers. There were eviction notices tied directly to campaign donations. But the most damning piece of all was a memo, unsigned, dated 3 days before Clarence's death. The words jumped out at him, cold and threatening. If Harmon testifies, make sure the case never sees light. Elijah knew what that meant. DeWitt had orchestrated this. He had known what Clarence was planning, and he had taken steps to silence him before the truth could be heard. The anger that erupted inside Elijah was visceral. It wasn't just the grief of losing Clarence. It was the realization that the system, the very foundation of justice, had been corrupted so thoroughly that it could erase a life like Clarence's without any consequence. Determined to see this through, Elijah did what few would have had the courage to do. He went to the district attorney's office and presented the evidence to Alan Greer, a man whose reputation was built on taking down the powerless, but always following the money when it came to the powerful. Elijah knew he wouldn't be taken seriously. He had expected to be dismissed, laughed at even, but he had underestimated Greer's ego. The prosecutor had laughed him out of the office, dismissing him as a child with no understanding of how the world truly worked. But Elijah wasn't about to back down. His heart was too heavy, too filled with the need for justice. So he filed a motion under his own name, invoking the power of the law and triggering an emergency hearing. Elijah knew that filing the motion would draw attention that he both wanted and feared. But he also knew it would make enemies, the kind of enemies who had the power to derail the case before it even started. What Elijah couldn't have predicted was just how far those enemies would go to protect DeWitt. The motion had succeeded. Barely. But success in this game didn't guarantee safety, and Elijah had already learned that nothing was as simple as it seemed. Back in court, the tide had shifted in his favor, at least for the moment. As Trammer's gavel slammed down again, the silence in the room was almost deafening. Elijah remained standing, his back straight, his hands calm despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He pulled a court order from his briefcase, the one he had worked so hard to secure, and placed it on the table. Greer, still recovering from the shock of Elijah's presence, read it aloud, his voice heavy with disbelief. "This boy," Greer grumbled, "is Elijah Harmon. Legal prodigy, co-counsel appointed by emergency order last night, signed by federal judge Yancey Monroe." The room went silent, the air thick with shock. The reporters, who had been murmuring to each other moments earlier, now held their breath. The gallery buzzed, gasps rising from every corner. Elijah could feel their eyes on him, some with pity, others with disdain. But no one dared speak, not when the judge's gavel had just fallen in Elijah's favor. Trammer, however, was not one to be easily impressed. He took the court order in his hand, read it quickly, his lips curling into a sneer as he processed the information. There was a moment of hesitation, the air charged with anticipation. And then, with a contemptuous flick of his wrist, he muttered, "Proceed." The command was sharp, but there was no real authority in it. It wasn't so much a permission as it was an acknowledgement that Elijah had won this round. But the fight was far from over. And while Elijah had gained a victory in the courtroom, outside those doors, something darker was unfolding. In a closed-door meeting later that day, high-ranking officials were already conspiring. The words exchanged between them were quiet, measured, but their intentions were clear. This case could not, under any circumstances, see the light of day. They would find a way to shut it down. They would discredit Elijah, paint him as an unstable child, and erase the evidence before it could do any more damage. The gears of power had already begun to turn. DeWitt had powerful allies who would stop at nothing to protect him. For Elijah, this was just the beginning. But the battle had already moved beyond the courtroom and into the dangerous underbelly of Washington, D.C. politics. The next move would not just be legal, it would be personal. And Elijah was ready to play a game he had never intended to be part of. Inside a private boardroom 4 floors above the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The walls were lined with polished oak paneling, and an immense chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals glinting in the dim, golden light. The view outside the floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city of Washington, D.C., alive and vibrant. But inside the room, it felt cold. Former Governor Malcolm Dresner, a tall, aging man with salt and pepper hair, leaned against the sleek marble counter, swirling a tumbler of scotch in his hand. His fingers tightened around the glass as he stared down at General Marcus Reddick, the stoic, imposing head of the Homeland Intervention Task Force. The general stood near the window, his uniform impeccably crisp, his face as unreadable as ever. Dresner's voice was low, but the weight of his words reverberated through the room. If that boy exposes DeWitt, this doesn't just take down a senator. It rewrites every housing decision for the last decade. We're talking class action chaos, billions, federal credibility. Reddick, his eyes narrowing slightly, gave a slow nod, his mind already calculating the consequences. Then we neutralize him. Leak a juvenile record. Question his mental health. Sow doubt. Dresner took a slow sip of his scotch, the amber liquid catching the light. Don't underestimate him. He's smarter than you think. He might be a kid, but he knows how to use the system. He's already starting to unravel things. The judge, Donald Trammer, sat at the far end of the room, his posture rigid. Trammer was a man who wielded power like a blade, but even he could sense that the boy had become a formidable force. He cleared his throat and added, "I can stall this long enough for a national distraction. Push it off the docket. We'll buy time until this all blows over." The group was silent for a moment, each person lost in their thoughts, calculating their next move. They were overconfident in their ability to control the situation, but they had no idea how deep Elijah's resolve ran. Back in the courtroom, Elijah had begun to dismantle DeWitt's defense piece by piece. He had been patient, methodical, waiting for the right moment to strike. With each cross-examination, the cracks in DeWitt's carefully constructed facade grew wider. Staffers who had been loyal to the senator for years began to crack under the pressure of Elijah's questioning. The tension in the room was palpable, and Elijah could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, but he was undeterred. His mind raced as he presented the digital records from Clarence's USB drive, showing property exchanges between DeWitt and several shell corporations. These corporations funneled large sums of money into DeWitt's federal re-election campaigns, money that had been taken directly from the pockets of the very people Clarence had tried to protect. The press outside the courtroom began to catch wind of the explosive details, and soon protesters arrived, gathering in the streets, chanting for justice. Elijah's actions were stirring something powerful, a wave of momentum that was impossible to stop. But the higher-ups were not ready to give up just yet. In a dramatic mid-session confrontation, Trammer's voice boomed through the room, his frustration evident. "This case is spiraling into conspiracy theory madness." He banged his gavel with such force that the sound echoed off the walls, but it only served to heighten the tension, not quell it. Elijah's gaze remained calm, unwavering. He met the judge's anger with quiet resolve, his voice steady as he replied, "Truth sounds like madness to those who fear it." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of the corrupt system. The courtroom went silent, the only sound the shuffle of papers and the low hum of whispers among the spectators. Elijah stood his ground, not backing down an inch, knowing that this moment would define the rest of the trial. He wasn't just fighting for Clarence anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been swept under the rug by those in power. He was fighting for the truth. As the day wore on, the pressure continued to build. Elijah's strategy was working. and it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. But just as the tide seemed to be turning in his favor, a new twist emerged, one that would change everything. One of DeWitt's own lawyers, a man who had once believed in the senator's cause, approached Elijah in the hallway. The lawyer's face was drawn, his hands trembling as he pulled Elijah aside. His voice was barely a whisper, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. "Check the deposition logs from the Veteran Affairs Committee. Look for March 3rd. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He had already pored over every piece of evidence he could find, but this was new. He nodded, his mind racing as he processed the information. "Why March 3rd?" he asked, but the lawyer just shook his head, his eyes filled with guilt and fear. "You'll see," he whispered, before quickly disappearing into the crowd. Elijah wasted no time. He returned to his desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up the deposition logs. He scrolled through the endless pages of legal jargon, his eyes scanning each line for something, anything, that could tie the final pieces together. And then, there it was. A transcript of Clarence's original testimony, the one that had mysteriously never made it into the public record. It was there, word for word, a chilling account of what had been going on behind closed doors, the story that DeWitt had worked so hard to bury. But it wasn't just the testimony that caught Elijah's attention. At the end of the transcript, there was a signature. Not Clarence's signature, but Judge Trammer's. The man who had been presiding over this case, the very man who had been trying to stall it from the beginning, had buried Clarence's testimony. He had signed off on it, hidden it away, ensuring that the truth would never see the light of day. Elijah's blood ran cold as the full weight of the conspiracy hit him. Trammer wasn't just a judge, he was part of the very system Elijah had been trying to take down. He was complicit in the crimes DeWitt had committed. And now, it wasn't just about exposing DeWitt. It was about exposing everything. He quickly gathered the evidence, his mind whirring with the implications of what he had just discovered. He had found the smoking gun, the key to bringing down everyone involved. But he knew that it wasn't enough to simply have the truth. He needed to make sure it could never be buried again. As he walked back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The reporters outside were no longer just reporting. They were questioning, demanding answers. The protesters had grown louder, their chants filling the streets. Elijah could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him, but he stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. Trammer, seated at the bench, looked up as Elijah approached. His eyes flickered with something, fear perhaps, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. Elijah locked eyes with him, the knowledge of what Trammer had done now a silent accusation between them. The judge had tried to bury the truth, but Elijah had found it, and now there was no going back. The trial had reached a boiling point, and the world was watching. Everything was about to change. The final hearing arrived, and with it, a media storm unlike any the courthouse had ever witnessed. The air was thick with the buzz of cameras, microphones, and a chorus of shouted questions from reporters desperate for the next headline. Protesters packed the courthouse steps, chanting for justice, their voices rising above the noise of the city. News vans from every major network crowded the streets, their satellite dishes swaying in the wind. It was no longer just a trial. It was a spectacle, a battle for the very soul of the system. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. Security had tripled in anticipation of the chaos. Officers were stationed at every door, in every corner, watching the crowd with wary eyes. Elijah sat at the prosecution's table, his fingers tight around his pen as he stared at the documents spread before him. The weight of the moment was heavy, but his focus never wavered. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about Clarence. This was about the truth that had been buried for far too long. Judge Trammer, who had been a constant thorn in the side of justice throughout the trial, tried one last time to throw the case out. He cited procedural irregularities, the same hollow excuse he had used countless times before, hoping to stall the inevitable. His voice was loud, demanding, and filled with the authority he believed he still had. But as his gavel came down, there was a sudden, forceful interruption. The doors to the courtroom flew open, and Federal Judge Yancey Monroe, a figure of calm yet undeniable power, stormed in. His presence alone seemed to extinguish the tension in the room, as if his arrival carried with it the weight of justice itself. Monroe didn't hesitate. He overrode Trammer's objections with a single motion, his voice firm as he commanded, "This trial will proceed. No more delays. We're finishing this today." It was a clear signal that the walls the system had tried to build around DeWitt were crumbling. The gallery fell silent, the tension now palpable in the air. Elijah rose to his feet, the weight of the entire country's gaze upon him. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath as he stepped to the front, the floor beneath him shaking with the significance of the moment. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. With the judge's final ruling, Elijah began his closing argument. His voice rang clear and steady as he walked the jury through the timeline of events. He began with Clarence's eviction, a cruel, heartless act carried out under DeWitt's orders. He laid out the forged documents that had been used to cover up the illegal transactions, the misappropriated housing funds that should have gone to veterans in need. And then, as the room watched in silence, he presented the final, damning piece of evidence, a hidden camera video showing DeWitt in a private moment, mocking Clarence after the eviction. In the video, DeWitt leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he spoke with one of his aides. "The old man's got heart, but no roof," he said, laughing. "A fitting end." The room went still. The gasps from the gallery were audible, the disgust and anger palpable in the air. Elijah let the video play through, each second a stark reminder of the man who had used his power to destroy lives for personal gain. Trammer, his face flushed with anger, slammed his gavel on the bench, trying to end the session early. "This is a circus," he shouted, his voice breaking through the moment of disbelief. "These are baseless accusations." But Monroe stood, his gaze unwavering. "Enough obstruction," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "The jury will decide, not you." And with that, the case was in the hands of the jury. Elijah returned to his seat, his mind racing as the final moments of the trial unfolded. He had done everything he could. He had exposed the truth. Now all that remained was for the jury to deliver the verdict. It didn't take long. The jury deliberated for just under an hour before returning to the courtroom, their faces a mixture of solemnity and resolve. As they handed the verdict to Monroe, the room held its breath. Monroe read it aloud, his voice steady and unwavering. "We, the jury, find Charles R. DeWitt guilty on all counts." A wave of relief and triumph washed over Elijah. He remained seated, his hands clenched together, his eyes fixed on the floor. It wasn't victory for him. It was victory for Clarence, for the countless others who had been silenced by the system. It was justice, finally served. Outside, chaos erupted. The media frenzy reached new heights as news of DeWitt's conviction spread like wildfire. Protesters in the streets cheered, their chants growing louder as they celebrated the triumph of truth over corruption. In the days that followed, the shockwaves of the trial continued to reverberate through the halls of power. Several senators, their involvement in DeWitt's schemes now exposed, were forced to resign in disgrace. Judge Trammer, who had been an obstacle at every turn, stepped down under immense pressure. The corrupt web that had protected DeWitt for so long was unraveling, and the pieces were falling apart. But for Elijah, the victory was bittersweet. He received a flood of letters in the days after the trial. Letters of gratitude, letters from across the country, from people who had watched and cheered as he stood up for what was right. Some offered their congratulations, others sent their support. But there were others, dark, threatening letters, death threats, anonymous and chilling. They warned him that he had made powerful enemies, enemies who would stop at nothing to see him silenced. But Elijah didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of the threats. He was afraid of nothing now. As he stood alone on the courthouse steps, the weight of the world still pressing down on him, he stared up at the sky. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue across the city, the light softening the harsh edges of the day. He felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if the chaos of the last few weeks had finally come to a close. The voices of the protesters, the cheers, the shouts of victory, all seemed distant now. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, he whispered softly, "Clarence, they finally saw you." In that moment, Elijah knew that his fight had not been for fame or recognition. He hadn't come to the courtroom for applause or accolades. He had come for truth. He had come for justice. And though the system had tried to crush him, tried to silence him, the truth had burned through the cracks. The truth had won, and that truth had a name: justice.